Ladies and gentlemen, good morning if you're in the US, especially on the West Coast. Good afternoon if you're East Coast, and good evening if you like myself and David, you are in the UK and in Europe. My name is Cluytens, and I am especially pleased to announce a three-part webinar with Charles Green, Charlie Green, David Tovey, and myself on the topic of trust, the topic of trust sales. And there's a little bit of a background here. Charlie and David and myself have been having conversations for a while now, about a year or so. And as it turns out, we think very similarly when it comes to the importance of trust and principles, and a specific approach that is based on thinking long term when it comes to sales and business development. And so when I reached out to Charlie and David and said, should we do a webinar? They were both very happy to do so. And the end result is what you are seeing today. I'm not going to give a long introduction. I'm going to give Charlie and David the opportunity to introduce themselves. But what I do want to do is, you know, this is going to be a no fluff webinar. This is going to be a lot of content. We're not going to spend a lot of time on introducing ourselves or talking about a broad concept. We're just going to dive right into it. The format is very simple. So Charlie is going to talk for about 15 minutes on the topic of trust and sort of outline his thinking. Then David is going to talk for another 15 minutes on principles and principled selling and his thinking and research. And then on the back end, I'll talk about what I think is the hidden factor, which is often not talked about, which is the concept of risk in the role that risk plays, because risk is sort of the flip side of trust, if you will. So with that, let me turn it over to my esteemed colleague and friend, Charlie Green, who will be talking about building trust. Hey, Charlie,
Okay,
take it away.
thanks, Ago. And again, just to underscore the sequence here, my role in this three-part series is to sort of lay out the foundations. How does trust work? What are the dynamics? How do you build it? And I'm going to flip through quickly. And as Ago said, it's going to be high content. So let me start off. You would think, thinking about trust, that it might be useful to begin by looking in the dictionary and defining the trust. It turns out it's not particularly helpful because trust turns out to be very, very contextual. For example, I might say casually, I trust my dog with my life, slide, but not with my ham sandwich, slide. And not a very good joke, but it is a joke. It's a joke, like many jokes, rests upon double meanings. Try explaining that to a Martian. Why would you rank a ham sandwich higher in the panoply of things than one's life? Well, we get it because we understand the multiple meanings of trust. But that contextual thing becomes very important when we talk about trust in business. So for example, next slide here. This is a very common kind of example. We see things like this all the time. Trust in financial institutions drops. Trust in banking is down. Trust in government is down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let me just look at the syntax of that with you. Trust is down, and let's parse that. Next slide. What does that really mean? Does it mean, A, that banks have become less trustworthy? Often that's what it means, but it could also mean, B, that people have become less willing to trust banks. It's not the same thing. Or more likely, C, some combination of the above here. Trustworthiness is a characteristic of the party that we trust. The propensity to trust is the party of the person doing the trusting. So it's a very simple concept here that trust actually is made up of a couple of things. First of all, to trust somebody, to be a trustor, that is the part where you take risks. It takes risks to trust somebody. On the other side, the party who's being trusted, the word trustworthy is appropriate here. It's an adjective. To be trusted is to be worthy of trust, to be trustworthy. So if we think of trust, it really is a composite of two things. First of all, it takes a trustor willing to take the risk. And if you put that together with, added to, a trustee, someone who is trustworthy enough, a couple of clicks here, Argo, please. And the net of that looks like trust. So when we talk about trust in general, we need to break it down and be more meaningful and say which are we actually talking about? Because until we're clear about that, it's not particularly useful. You can't really do anything with it. In fact, unfortunately, Howard, you can't take just one side in trust, too. If you want to create trust, if you want to make trust happen, it's not enough just to be trustworthy, which is what we often think. If I'm really trustworthy, it will work. No, if, in fact, if you're always just being trustworthy, the one being trusted, and you never take a risk, eventually the other person is going to say, hey, this is one-sided. I'm taking all the risks here. So what that means is, just to summarize, we have to do both. We have to be trustworthy, and we have to learn how to constructively take some risks ourselves. So trust is a two-sided game, and this is relevant, by the way, because we often think, you hear things like President Reagan years ago said, trust but verify. Well, if you're verifying, you're cutting out the risk. It just doesn't work that way. So let's look at both sides. Let's look first at trustworthiness, which is what we usually mean. When we say trust in banking is down, we usually mean banks are less trustworthy. Or when we think of can we be trusted, can we be trustworthy, this is what we're talking about. So let's break this one down a little bit. Trustworthiness, I present to you the trust equation. Trust actually, it works pretty well in the form of an equation. And let's break that down piece by piece. Credibility plus reliability plus intimacy, all divided by self-orientation. Now let me quickly define each of those, and then we'll talk about them in turn. First of all, sometimes when we mean trust or trustworthiness, what we're talking about is credibility. Next slide. And when we say trustworthiness as credibility, what we mean is it has to do mostly with the words that are spoken or the words that are read. In a sentence, we might say, I can trust what she says about this particular topic, this subject. And we mean the logic makes sense. That's a recent version of PowerPoint. I recognize the degree hanging on the wall. It hangs together. I get it. I believe what she's saying. I trust her. Very common meaning of the word trust. But it's not the only one. Next meaning, next slide, sometimes we say trustworthiness, we mean actions, reliability. This one has to do not with words, but actions. We might say in a phrase, I can trust him too. I can trust Ago to click and pass the slides all along in a presentation like this. He has never let me down. He's utterly dependable. He's reliable. I trust him. And we're all familiar with that sense of the word too. The next one, I'm sure you're wondering, intimacy. What's that about? Well, that's a very interesting one. Sometimes we mean intimacy when we talk about trust. And here, it's a sense of security, like I can trust her with this information. If I share this with her, she'll know what to do with it and what not to do with it and who to tell it to and who to pass it along to and who not to. I can trust her. And then finally, in the denominator of the equation, we have this thing called self-orientation. Because it's in the denominator, that means the higher the self-orientation, the lower the trustworthiness. It's about who we're paying attention to. If one's focused on oneself all the time, you're not going to be very trusted by others. If we interact with somebody and they're constantly focused on themselves, their own motives, you're not likely to trust them. Now, much more could be said about that, but not here today. Very quickly, though, I do want to tell you that we did some analyses based on a survey of this. About 16,000 people, actually about 50,000 by now, have taken this little quiz, and I want to share very quickly some data about what the trust quotient turns out to map by. Next slide. First of all, it turns out that women are statistically significantly more trustworthy than men, interestingly enough. And it's also turns out that almost all the difference between women scoring more highly trustworthy than men is due to one of those four factors. And that factor is, wait for it, pause, intimacy. Women tend to do better at that. Not surprising then that among the most trusted professions we find nursing. Every time you see surveys, with the possible exception of surveys in Australia, where firemen tend to rank higher, almost always you'll find nursing comes at the top of the list. And it's no accident that nursing is largely a female profession. We are literally and figuratively naked in front of nurses, and it's okay. We share with them and we trust them. At the bottom of the list in most countries, you will find lawyers or politicians, etc. Next slide. One of the findings of this study is, somewhat to my surprise, that the most powerful factor is not S, self-orientation, as we had originally thought when we did the equation, but actually intimacy. So let me just stop and underscore that. The most powerful component of trustworthiness is this factor of intimacy. Do people feel comfortable sharing with us? And I want to underscore this because I'll bet you most of the people on this phone call, as are most of the people in the world, inclined to believe that the predominantly powerful factors of trustworthiness lie in credibility and reliability. And I'm here to tell you they don't. The soft skills trump the hard skills in this area, and that's very important. It turns out that if you take nothing away from this seminar, but this next thing I'm about to say, this will be powerful. The most powerful thing you can do to create intimacy and trust is to, wait for it, listen. Listening is a profoundly powerful component that creates trust. Now, let's switch over to trusting. We just talked about trusted, being trustworthy, but let's look about trusting. There is no trust without risk. As I said, Ronald Reagan was throwing smoke when he talked about trust but verify. But you can't have it. The truth is you can't have trust without risk. That raises the question in business, who's going to take the first risk? And most of us like to sit around and wait for our clients to take the risk. But the truth is you make your own luck. And unless you're willing to aggressively wait for the phone to ring or wait for the other person to extend their hand first, it's just like waiting for the other person to ask you out on a date. If you want to make something happen, you need to learn how to take the risk. So click, click, Ago. We need to make our own luck by learning how to trust. Well, let's talk about that. There are two kinds of errors that happen in trusting, and it's easiest, I think, to use the language of religion here. Errors of commission and errors of omission. The first one is the risk of doing the wrong thing. That's an error of commission, committing an error, doing the wrong thing. The second type is the risk of not doing the right thing. Go ahead and click. And those are different. If you imagine, for example, a lifeguard. Let's say there's a lifeguard sitting up on the chair and there's some person out there waving their arms. And the lifeguard says to him or herself, well, gee, maybe they're just waving hello. Maybe they're not really in trouble. And besides, my suntan is not yet done. I don't want to look foolish jumping out there. I'll just wait and see if they get in more trouble. Well, that would be the wrong thing to do, because that is the risk of not doing the right thing. That's an error of omission. And for fear of doing something like ruining your suntan or looking silly, we opt too often for obeying the risk of doing the wrong thing. So click. What happens is we over-avoid type 1 error. We're overly afraid of doing the wrong thing, and therefore we constantly commit type 2 error. So next slide. What we fear most is saying, mentioning something that shouldn't be said, saying something wrong, looking foolish, jumping ahead, mentioning cost too soon, being seen as unprofessional, etc., etc. And what we do, therefore, is absorb that risk and do nothing. Well, nothing is the worst thing we can do. So there's a simple phrase. Here's maybe the second or third thing you want to take away from my little piece here. A simple phrase that you can remember to start taking that risk, and it is simply this: 4 words, at the risk of, and then fill in whatever it is that you're afraid of. At the risk of being, mentioning price a little bit too soon, at the risk of being a little bit overly personal, at the risk of appearing quite foolish and ignorant about what I'm about to say, and then you say the thing that needs saying, the elephant in the room, so to speak. This is a form of social risk mitigation. It is learning how to say the thing that everybody's afraid of saying. But the fact is, that is how you take a risk in a socially acceptable manner, I would say. And that's how you begin the process of creating trust. You take the first risk. You acknowledge that it may be all your fault. That triggers the very natural response of reciprocity on the part of the other person. If you think about the hundreds of ways in every little social interaction that we reciprocate, starting with a smile and a handshake. If I reach out to you with my hand extended and a smile, your natural response is going to be to extend your hand to me and smile also. If you don't do that, if you frown and turn away from me and pull away your hand, I am profoundly insulted, because we reciprocate here. The first person takes the little bit of risk, and the natural human response, trust creating, is to reach back and reciprocate. So just to sum up my little notion, or my little front end here of things, how trust works, let's put it this way. To increase trust, the first thing you have to do is increase your trust quotient by being more trustworthy, credible, reliable, intimate, low self-orientation. And the next thing we have to do is increase our skills at risk-taking, which increases our ability and our odds of trusting. And if you add those two together, those two skills, you end up creating greater trust. So Argo, I'm going to flip it back to you and David, but that's my put on how it is that we go about building trust. That's the mechanics of it. That's the basics.
All right, and thank you so much, Charlie, for that wonderful introduction. When we spoke, we knew it was going to be a challenge because we're all very passionate about our topics, and we're all very passionate about what we talk about. And you, my friend, did it in exactly 15 minutes flat. So I
We aim
commend
to
you on
please.
that. I thank
Let me
you
just
for.
notice. You're welcome. Let me just notice one of the components of trustworthiness is reliability, and one easy way to build reliability is say how long you're going to take and then do it.
Absolutely. All right. So, Charlie, honestly, I couldn't have done a better job. Unfortunately, as we're on the topic of trust, there is an unfortunate coincidence. It appears that the one thing that we cannot trust in this day and age is technology and weather, because apparently for the last 15 minutes or so, David, who was going to be the second, sort of presenter in the lineup, has dropped off the call and cannot get back into the webinar software. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to flip forward to my part, which is the third section, and hopefully, in the meantime, David, has found a way of coming back in. And apologies, Charlie, if I didn't appear entirely trustworthy in terms of advancing your slides. It was because I was juggling a
You were
screen and
fine.
and an iPhone and answering email to David and trying to sort out the tech issues at the
I know
same
you were,
time.
and you did great.
So all right, let's take it forward here because, you know, in my thinking, here's how I think about trust. Trust is about building a it's about building a long-term relationship, right? It's about building a future, and you can't build a future by yourself. So I like the way you think, Charlie, about, there's two sides to the trust equation. There's the trustor and the trustee. Someone has to do the trusting, and as a relationship develops, that relationship changes, and the sort of the flow of that, of those two change, right? Someone has to do the trusting at some times, and then, at other times they have to be the person earning the trust. And I love this quote by Maria Snyder, which is, trusting is hard, but knowing who to trust, that's even harder. And the biggest problem, the way I see it, is really our human tendency, if you will, to go into fight or flight mode. And I'm having some more tech issues here with the sort of webinar software. Trying to keep it at bay. So fight or flight mode. Um, and fundamentally, people think in two dimensions. It's, what do I want less of, and what do I want more of? Now, in terms of what we want less of, we typically want less of things like loss and the pains and the afflictions. Sorry, I'm just really having an issue here. Not sure what's going on. Just a second there. Apologies. Otherwise, I'll go really, really fast in terms of my presentation. So
Yeah, no, that's okay.
fundamentally, people think in two dimensions. It's loss. What do I want to get rid of? What do I want to, apologies for the screen to keep flipping back and forth. Let me just do this. I'm just going to show it to you this way. It doesn't look as pretty, but at least it works. So fundamentally, people think in two dimensions, right? We think in loss. So what are the things that we we want more of, the affliction or the aspirations, the wants, the things that we want more of, the things that we crave in our life, if you will. And then the other dimension is the gain. So the opposite is pains and afflictions. What are the things that we want less of? What are the things that we don't want? Now, interestingly, I find that in truth, people don't think just in those two dimensions. They think in three dimensions. And let's just take that to a business context for a second. If I am a corporate manager or executive, and I am looking for a provider to make a decision or to do a project on, let's say, a systems integration, right? Sort of sizable project, sizable budget, I'm not just going to think in terms of what I want. What I want is for this project to go well, for the benefits to materialize, for the outcomes to, be the outcomes that I desire. I also don't want to get stuck in things like, the budget overrunning. I don't want to get stuck in things like, an endless extension on the back end of the time frame. And the third component is risk. It's the risk of, if I do this, what is the likelihood of something going wrong? And there's really two components to that risk, which is, what's the likelihood of something going wrong, and how bad is it if something does go wrong? And those are really things that often as sellers and often as people that are sort of in business development, we're not fully conscious of. So what we do at Ring Group is we do a lot of research. And so, and I know you've seen I know you've seen the study, Charlie. So recently, sort of end of last year, we did the research, and earlier this year, 2013, we came out with it. We asked 700 business-to-business buyers why they bought, and we were really trying to answer two fundamental questions. And the first question was, okay, why did you pick provider A versus firm B? Why did you pick one provider over another? And the second question was, um, what's the likelihood of you doing repeat business with them in the future again, based on that first choice? And the results were absolutely surprising. We ended up with a top 10 of factors. I'll give you the first one, which is educated me with new ideas and perspectives. So for all of those of you who haven't seen the research, if you're kind of wondering, Charlie gave you two quick takeaways. I'll give you one here. The number one factor why buyers decide to go for firm A versus firm B is because they educated them with new ideas and perspectives. But interestingly, as you go deeper into that list, into that top 10, you'll find that 3 out of the 10 factors were actually related to risk and trust. Risk and trust is huge in corporate decision making. And very specifically, the following factors showed up in our study as important in minimizing risk. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire list, but it's the usual suspects, right? Things like the provider is respected, they have experience, the guy that was talking to me, the seller, was professional, he inspired confidence. Interestingly, here, two things. One, the seller was trustworthy. This is the exact term and terminology that buyers used when describing a seller they wanted to do business with. And the second one
And
is
I would add, Ago, by the way, the people, again, back to the notion that trust is contextual, people understand what that means, and they mean exactly the way we defined it before.
absolutely, absolutely. And the other one is, and it's kind of that thing about, you can't say you're trustworthy. You have to show that you're trustworthy, right? How do you do that? Well, you do that by all of the other things, helping your buyers see potential pitfalls or areas where things may go off the rails, depicting the purchase process accurately, not holding things back. Being generally professional, the sort of quick comment we made about, how impressed I was with you keeping to your 15 minutes. I mean, those are the bare basics. But the thing is this: we all know this. A huge influencer in the buying decision is how the seller behaves and what the buying experience is like. Because for a buyer, the buying experience is one of the biggest predictors to look at in terms of what it's going to be like ultimately working with that firm.
Exactly.
So all of these things are confidence builders, and they're all about minimizing the perception of risk. So it's really not just about trust. I mean, trust is a huge factor, but the flip side, the corollary, if you will, of that is risk. So,
Yeah, Ago, excuse me, if I can just add something. Apologies
of
for
course,
interrupting.
of course,
Uh, to underscore what you said, the way you appear trustworthy is not by insisting that you're trustworthy. In fact, trust me is about the most trust-destroying thing you can say. It's all these other things that you do and that people infer from it, and that's how we communicate that we're trustworthy.
absolutely, absolutely, and thanks for sort of contributing that, Charlie. Here's the thing. Ultimately, when it comes to trust, and I'm being very specific here, when it comes to the role of trust in the buying process, buyers want sellers who, one, persuade them they would achieve results. Interestingly, at the very same time as we're doing this webinar, another sort of colleague, Lee Frederickson at Hinge Marketing, is doing another webinar where they're talking about their research in terms of how buyers buy. Now, I scanned through it today, and this is one of the things that comes up. Um, Buyers want sellers who persuaded me they would achieve results. Interestingly, sellers are not conscious of that. Sellers don't think that's important. Buyers think that is hugely important. Buyers want sellers who help them avoid potential pitfalls.
Right.
They want sellers who can come in and say, that's not going to work, and here's why. Obviously, doing it respectfully, et cetera, et cetera. And then buyers want sellers who depict the purchasing process accurately, not just by the way the purchasing process, but also the post-purchasing process, i.e., the implementation. And so, in terms of conclusion, we really talk about three levels of selling. If you want to be successful in business development today, you really need to do three things, and those are connect, convince, and collaborate. And I'll talk a little bit about what those three mean, and specifically in terms, what they mean in terms of building sales. And again, we're not just talking about sales today; we're talking about sales tomorrow. So it's not just about um, do I go with vendor A versus vendor B or firm A versus firm B? It's also how does that influence my decision making in the future, providing they obviously don't go off the rails and do something horribly wrong. So there are three levels, three things, three sort of sequences, if you will, that help us understand what sets winners apart from those who come in second place. And the first level is really connect. Buyers are looking for sellers who can connect the dots between what they need in their company's products and services. Sounds obvious, sounds self-evident. Very surprisingly, um, few sellers do a very good job at that. Um, and I think the reason is because, and I've been a buyer before, so maybe that sort of influences my perception or my thinking. But ultimately, and maybe Charlie, we can talk about this later in the post webinar Q&A. But interestingly, I think that the mindset of the seller is to come in and think about, okay, what am I getting out of this? I want to make this deal. I want to win this client. I want to gain this engagement. Whereas real trust is often built on understanding the other one's perspective and the other's perspective. So
And again, Ago, I'm sorry for if you'll permit me, that maps directly back to that denominator factor of self-orientation in the trust equation. Paradoxically, if you give up worrying about yourself, you end up doing better for yourself.
you know what? That is so true. Um, can you like print that on a poster and send that my way so I can hang that on my office wall? I love the quote, and it's so true. It's so true. It sounds counterintuitive. It sounds contradictory, but I think everybody on this call will sort of intuitively understand that that is true. That is human nature. The
Yeah,
more we care about others, the more we ultimately end up serving ourselves.
true.
Um, and so I mean, connection goes both ways. So it's about connecting the dots between what the customer needs and what you can offer, and also um, connecting with the person. And again, trust is so important. It's really about building that personal one-on-one relationship. The behavior, the actions, the trustworthiness of the seller is such a huge driver of corporate decision maker or corporate decision making. I can't stress this enough. I mean, in both the research as well as my own experience, really convinces me of this. So with that, I'll sort of go into the. I've already used the word level two is to convince. And here's the thing: buyers want to be convinced that they can achieve maximum or at least reasonable return. They want to be convinced that they can do it with minimal risk. That's what I said before. The sort of missing component, what I wanted to bring to the conversation here is that it's not just about return. It's kind of like investing, right? High volatility stocks, sure, they can yield huge returns, but the risk of things going the wrong way is also sort of significantly high. So it's
Right.
really that's not something you want in a B2B purchasing process where you're about to spend $2.5 million on a systems integration project or something. So risk minimal, and the seller is the best choice amongst all options. So that's really about what we at Rain Selling call differentiate. How are you different? And different, again, I think is wrongly used in most sales conversation. It's not just about being different; it's about being better. When we say how are you different, we mean how are you better. And then the
Right.
third level is to collaborate. And collaborate, you really do that through practicing what you preach, walking your, talking your, now walking your talk. That's what it is. Yeah, are you responsive? Are you proactive? Are you easy to buy from? Are you collaborative in the way you work? Do you keep your commitments? Do you sometimes come out with the occasional surprise where you may send something early, or you'll send something, that goes above and beyond the call of duty? So, in terms of when it comes to trust, I wanted to give two things, and sort of the key messages to take away, if you will, are one, the corollary or the flip side of trust is risk. So don't just think about how you can manage trust better and be more trustworthy, but also think about how you can reduce risk, especially for the people that you deal with in a business context. And the second message I wanted to give was if you want to have some practical ideas and applications around how to build that trust, it's really about three things: connecting with your buyer on a personal level, connecting the dots between what they need and you offer, convincing them that you can achieve results that you promise, that you're better suited or in a better position to do it than your competition, and that you can do it with minimal risk. And then finally, walking the talk, practicing what you preach, being responsive, proactive, and easy to buy from. So with that, unfortunately, it seems like David, our third speaker, has completely dropped off the grid. I know they're having some
Yeah, it's
storms
a shame.
up in the UK. So what I thought we'd do is, I mean, I don't feel comfortable talking about what David was going to talk about, which is his entire
No.
approach and his philosophy on principal selling, which is so important. If you're watching this, I know it's a poor substitute. If you go to the website there, sort of Cluytens.com, there's an interview with David. It's an interview with Charlie as well. And if you watch those interviews, it'll give you a sense of their thinking in terms of principal selling and in terms of how to build trust. So with that, Charlie, I think if you're happy with that, should we turn it over to questions and then hopefully we'll be able to give folks some answers? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
All right. So this is a time where you can where you can submit your questions. I'm already seeing some questions come in, and Josh was asking what was that website. Josh, the website is I'll flip back there quickly for you. It's ahoclutens.com. You can go there, and if you just Google either David's name or Charlie's name, then you'll come up to the interviews as well. Charlie, first question here as well. Can you go deeper? Can you give some tips on on a practical level? How can you appear more trustworthy in a business context? Any?
Sure. Bunches. I mean, first of all, you can go down the list of credible, reliable, intimate, low self-orientation. Um, Actually, first of all, come to think of it, if anybody wants to send me an email, I will happily send you a page of 82 things that you can do to improve trustworthiness. So if that's not pitching too much, see Green at trustedadvisor.com. But let me highlight a couple of them. The single best thing you can do, bar none, is listen. And I don't mean practice it as a skill like mirroring or anything. I mean sit there and get rid of all thoughts in your head. Let your tongue hang out. Absolutely listen for content and stop worrying about what you're going to say in response to it. Just listen. The purpose of that is to acknowledge the other person, to validate them, to let them know that they're actually being heard. Because what triggers all this positive trust response is first and foremost a sense that the other person respects us, gets us, understands us, knows where we're coming from. Some of the best sales research says that people have a strong propensity to buy what they have to buy anyway from people who understand what they want, who understand them on a deep level. So number one is listen. And I'll quickly rattle off a few other things. Under reliability, as I mentioned, set some deadlines and meet them. That's one where you can arbitrarily set a whole lot of things. I'm going to talk for 15 minutes, then do it. I'm going to have this to you by the end of the day, then do it. Another one that you can do is get good at answering emails or phone calls incredibly fast. Get back to people, zoom, zoom, zoom. They don't expect it. It removes worries from them, and it allows you to proactively schedule things going forward. Now, I know you can't do that all the time in this day and age, but when you can, it's very powerful. A couple other things. Um, uh, Geez, I'm trying to pull from a list of things here. On the intimacy thing, uh, don't tell people what they should be. No, sorry, let me back up. If you see somebody looking a certain way, behaving a certain way, just comment on it. Gosh, you look a little bit upset by that. I get the sense that you don't like my answer. You seem to be a little nervous. I notice you're looking at your watch. Do we need to take a break? Acknowledge what you see from the other person. And if you don't understand it, just say, I see you looking at your watch. I don't know what that means. Should we stop and talk about something? Don't be afraid of commenting on the emotions that are happening, including yourself. Another way to increase trust is to say, listen, I got to be honest, I'm a little bit nervous right now. Radical credibility. Say things that are true. and be incredibly strong about the truth. If somebody says, how much experience do you have? You tell them exactly. 17 clients, 42 elapsed months, and so forth. If somebody says, why should we buy from you? You say, I don't know yet. We haven't talked. Let's talk, and then I'll tell you whether you should buy from me or not. I'll stop there. There's a whole bunch, and some of them are on that list of 82.
Charlie, I love that, and I've actually seen the list. It's just a great recap of the practical, tangible things that we can do. And I want to add sort of two more from my own perspective, and I'll
Please.
talk about sort of when I used to be in a large corporation wearing the buying hat, things that invariably caused me to trust people. Especially people that were sort of in some way selling to me, because there's always that kind of slight, whether we acknowledge it or not, there's always that slight apprehension when you're a buyer about someone who's coming in to sell you on something. And they can be
Sure.
very professional and they can be very relaxed in their sales approach and everything else. But there is sort of that, I call it the used car salesman trauma. We all have that fear of somebody coming in and pitching us, right, and trying to pull one
Right.
over on us, and it's very strong as a human reaction. And there's two things that invariably actually three things that invariably got me out of that and caused me to virtually instantly start trusting a person. The first thing was if those showed their vulnerable side. So if you
Yes.
hinted at this before, right? Don't hide behind a mask. Come in and don't pretend you're not human. You're a person just like anybody else. And
Absolutely.
sometimes that can be saying, I'm not comfortable with the way things are going, or I have a question, or I'm not sure where we're at. The second thing is when they countered my opinion and they had good arguments to do so, and I could see how their way was the better way. I mean, almost an instant trust builder. uh,
Exactly.
and the third one, surprisingly, and I have no idea, Charlie, if this ever came up in your research, but the third one was just humor, having a good sense of humor and being able to
Sure.
step outside of the situation and take the seriousness out of the air, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And you can. Humor is a wonderful thing. You can say things like, well, this is awkward,
Yeah, yeah,
or
exactly.
that's one of the harder questions I heard. I'm not sure I haven't answered that just yet, etc.
Yeah. I guess the most awkward thing is that we're still missing our third man, but
Yeah. Well, you
all right.
called it out.
We had another question come in. So someone had a question on slide 47, which was a slide about the three levels of range selling. But I think the general question was really about, can we give examples around, um, and just, I think the question goes to, how can we become, we all know that trust and being a trusted advisor is important, but then the conversation just stops. It's kind of like this
Yeah.
thing that we put out there and we say, yes, every, um, and you can sort of almost substitute seller for consultant and coach,
Yes.
financial advisor, whatever, wants to be a trusted advisor, but nobody's really telling us how. I think we give some great examples there in terms of how to do it. So let's kind of let's move forward to that. And by the way, to the person who asked that question, if you feel we didn't answer your question, just repeat it in the question box and give us a little bit more background, and then be happy. Charlie and I'd be happy to go into more detail. All
Yeah.
right, another question. Oh, this is a great one. Is there a preferred channel to build trust? Face to face, telephone, email? How do you build
Oh
trust
yeah.
if you cannot talk or speak with a buyer? Charlie, you want to take that one?
Well, sure. The higher the bandwidth, the better. Face to face trumps phone, phone trumps email, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, Always, we have an incredible ability as human beings to absorb input on multiple levels. That said, sometimes you need to be at the right level. There is a role for text messaging. There is a role for very mechanical things. You need to match up the role with the task at hand and recognize that our basic systemic error is to under bandwidth rather than over bandwidth. If you find yourself calling somebody at 12:45 p.m. because you know they're at lunch and you're going to leave a voicemail, check your motives. You need to jack it up a level and a higher bandwidth. But trust is primarily personal, and personal happens in direct contact much more so than in indirect or written or so forth. We often think that things like unique selling propositions or statements of business or principle are trust creating. They're not near as trust creating as an honest interaction.
Charlie, I agree with you, but I'm also going to respectfully disagree on one core
Sure.
aspect, and that's just because I also want to be true to myself and trustworthy to everybody on the call, which is I think as habits are changing and as technology is changing, I think more and more we're seeing other ways of building trust. I will never rule out the importance of face-to-face live interaction. That is crucial. But I've had several deals where I have not had the opportunity to sit down with a client face to face in a live setting,
Right.
and that's happening increasingly. So the one thing that I will say is it's almost not about is there a preferred channel. There is a preferred sequence. What I mean by that is with the technology we now all have in terms of doing webinars like this, email marketing, content marketing, inbound, outbound, whatever. I would almost say that at the front of the funnel, where you're really generating leads and generating interest and building your brand, whether it's as a seller or as a firm, that's a great place to leverage the power of technology, right? And you can build trust over time by consistently. I mean, the mechanics are the
Absolutely.
same. Deliver great content. Do
Yeah,
it.
we're actually in violent agreement on that one, Ago. It's in this day and age, you cannot expect nor will you get as much frequent face-to-face interaction, and not nearly as much. It's just a general statement in the abstract. All else equal, higher levels of personal interaction will create greater trust, but they are not equal. To your point, I completely agree with you.
Absolutely. So it's not either or. It's sort of, throughout the sales cycle, they will vary. And moving on, next question, which is someone asking for comments. Charlie and I love commenting on stuff like this. So it seems like trust is an excellent way of providing value and demonstrating differentiation in a business environment, particularly in businesses that are viewed or industries that are viewed as commodities. Any comments?
Absolutely.
I'll yeah, I mean, sort of beyond what's your thinking, Charlie?
Well, yeah, in a commodities industry, not much else does differentiate you, but that's an enormous differentiator. My stock example is you picture some woman, divorced single mother of three, who's the office manager in some boondocks place, and one kid is homesick from school, and the paper's piling up at work, and the dog won't eat the dog food, and life is a crazy. But fortunately, the Xerox paper salesman comes in every Tuesday, and he or she actually seems to care, and they understand what it's like, and they get it. And you know what? Why would you buy paper from anybody else? It's just you don't even mind paying a little bit more. At least somebody in the world seems to give a damn, understand, willing to do a favor when necessary, etc. That is worth something, and it's all personal.
Absolutely. Here's the way I would phrase it, and let me try to just sort of structure it a little bit. The way that we think about the value proposition, which is another way of saying how do you differentiate yourself in a business environment, right? The way that we think about it is there's sort of three steps. They are um, resonate, differentiate, and substantiate. That's kind of the three steps you want to take. Now, all those three are related to trust. Resonate is about what I mentioned before about building that personal connection. I mean, every single sales process, worth its salt, every single sort of sales cycle that I've ever come across, every single human interaction starts with that. It starts with the foundations, connecting one on one, connecting as one person to another. So that's
And by the way, if David were on this call, he'd be all over this one with track shoes. Exactly right.
right, exactly. And I mean, so that's the first level. You'll really resonate. The second one is differentiate. Now, differentiate. That's where you start explaining how you are different. But you can't just say we're different. You have to, and that's a third part, that's a trick. You have to substantiate. Now, to me,
Right.
it's almost like this little equation, and the substantiate part is where you build the trust. It's like saying, here's the proof in the pudding, right? Here's why you can trust me that we are in fact different. So let's move forward. Um,
By the way, I
maybe
call that selling by doing, not selling by telling. Give them a sample selling. If you're in an intangible services business, pretend you're in the perfume business. Give them a sample.
Yeah, and it goes back to my point. One of the biggest influencers and predictors um, well, no, sorry, one of the biggest influencers of why a buyer, and I keep going back to buyers because that I've been that for so long. Why a buyer would pick firm A versus firm B is because the sales guy is trustworthy and the sales process is going well, and he's taking that as a leading indicator of, if the sales process is going this well, then, well, no
Right.
doubt the project itself will go well, and I can trust this guy. So all right, next one. Someone saying trust is people can identify quickly what you specialize in as a company. I experience it's extremely difficult to sell your own services. You intend to sell many facets of your own know-how that can be confusing for people. On the other side, reducing your know-how to one facet is also difficult. Any views on this? Right. So I,
Yeah. What
I, I
I've
guess
been
it's sort of that 1, 2, 3 where, in order to trust, people need to understand what you do. It's very difficult to pin down all that you do and you can do into one thing. So how would we approach
Yeah,
that?
let me comment on that. And I'm going to assume, I'm going to presume that I understand what's behind that person's question. I'm going to make some inferences here. What I infer from those three parts of that question is that it's really about qualifications. How do I explain what I'm good at? How do I get people to understand my capabilities and so forth? And my answer is don't go there. The role of your credibilities and stuff is like the role of a resume in an interview. It's only to get you in the door. Once you're in the door, so to speak, whether that's literally you're in a conversation or whatever, stop it. Don't talk about yourself. Talk only or almost entirely about the client and their issues. And your credentials and your qualifications will show through by the quality of the questions and the occasional commentary that you have on what the client is saying. But it's more important that you demonstrate focus, interest, insightful questions than that you spend any more time at all convincing people about how smart you are and what you're smart at.
Charlie, I actually have nothing to add to that. That was a great recap. I feel completely the same. It doesn't happen very often to have nothing to add, but in this case, that's where we are. You've said it.
Yeah.
So next question here is, how do you rebuild trust when your client is not? Oh, love this one. How do you rebuild trust when your client is not trusting you because you made a mistake in the past? How do you
Oh, I love
how
it
do you
too.
rebuild trust that is damaged?
You wanna lead on that one, and I'll follow up.
Sure. I think, you know, the way I think about it, and I'm not by a long shot, I'm not the expert on thinking on trust, but I'll just sort of, go into my, kind of look at my business experience here. I think the way to do it is, one, to acknowledge the mistake that's been made. I'd say two, to make an honest and sincere apology and make amends in whatever way is possible.
Mm-hmm.
And three is to show the person how you will work to regain their trust and make sure that whatever happened never happens again.
Yep.
I think sort of that's a sort of a 1, 2, 3 process that I would use. Does that make sense, Charlie?
Absolutely. I'm going to add just two tunings on it, but I completely agree with that fundamental sequence. On the first one, here's a tactical rule. It, rather than just acknowledging, you need to slightly over acknowledge to sort of compensate for the fact of it. So you want to depending on how bad it was, that's how many caveats you put up front. You want to say, I realize this lost you time, and it must have been painful for this, and it must have been painful for that. Until the other person says, okay, you get it. Then you've done your job. So slightly overcompensate on the acknowledgement side. And then careful with apologies. You need to be precise. You need to apologize for the things that were your responsibility. Sometimes I hear people go wrong. For example, phone salespeople from banks and so forth, or technology companies, they're all like, "Oh, I'm so sorry that happened. Oh, I do apologize." Well, it wasn't their fault, so it's pretty empty. Don't apologize for something that wasn't your fault. You don't need to say that wasn't my fault. That's not good. But don't, apologize precisely for what was in your control and what you messed up on. And then that sets you up to do your third step, which is to say, here's what I'm going to do to make sure, it doesn't happen again, and you go forward rightly.
Absolutely. And one thing, I always like thinking about the opposite. I think the worst thing you can do is to completely ignore that whatever happened happened,
Oh, good point.
and just somehow try to smooth it over and try to, try to go immediately go to, okay, so how can we do better in the future? That certainly doesn't work. All right,
You're very right.
Charlie, final question that's come in, which is, I'm impressed, by the way, because we only allowed, we were thinking about having 15 minutes for Q&A, and we're 20 minutes and counting. And pretty much everybody who was on the call is still there. So thank you, in
Right.
spite of the technical challenges that we've had.
Yes. Thanks to everybody.
So final question here. I love this question as well. How different is the millennial buyer? So how different are sort of the millennials to this trust environment? How different does the trust dynamic work across generations, Charlie?
Well, I want to hear your answer too, but I would say, first of all, we're more similar than different. People are people. At the level of the stuff that we're talking about, human dynamics are pretty much the same. That said, there are differences, and the difference, I think, is that millennials in particular think of it in terms of broad and deep. Millennials are far easier creating broad level of quick surface level trust. They're better at that. They are worse at creating deep levels of trust. So if you're a boomer, for example, like me, you need to take into account people are going to make snap judgments, and they're going to look very surfacey, like they're interested, they're going on, but they haven't bought in. I need to remember that. And people that are millennials, you're very good at socially interacting with everybody, but you need to work on taking greater risks, making yourself vulnerable, and actually finding out what are you afraid of and learning to overcome your fears. That's my take on it. Naga, what do you have to say?
I'd agree. Fundamentally, people are people, and trust is as important it's just important across generations. Now, there's one thing I believe, and that's just more based on my own personal experience and the research. I believe millennials are typically very community oriented,
Uh-huh.
and so I think they will trust as you mentioned. I think they'll trust quickly, they'll trust broadly, they'll trust a wide set of people, um, and I also think you know um, I think if I mean just again my own personal experience, um, I think a particular interest is not just thinking about across generations, but also across cultures. Charlie, we've
Hmm.
had another question come in, but I sort of want to squeeze that in very opportunistically because I know that you and I are on opposite sides of the Atlantic, but I also know that we fly across to the other side, and we have experience working in sort of
Sure.
globally, I suppose. What's your thoughts on how trust works across continents as well as
Two
generations?
thoughts.
Hmm.
First of all, the trust equation dynamics it's valid across all cultures. You can analyze all of them in those terms. The factors, the weighting of them may vary a little bit. And the biggest variation is something that we've been talking about today, which is risk. The biggest difference in the whole trust equation thing that I see is people's cultural, social willingness to aggressively take risks. And let me, at one end of the continuum, the very risk averse, very careful, don't rock the boat kind of risk tolerance
Don't
in
don't talk about
interactions.
Belgians, Charlie. Don't talk about Belgians.
I'm not going to talk about Belgians,
All right.
but we're going to come close. At the low risk end, people are very, very formulaic, very careful, very methodical. The Japanese, no surprise to anybody on this call, and I would say the English. The English are also extremely worried about appearing out of sorts, out of order, and they have evolved to use words, word clouds, storms of words, almost the way Japanese use bowing and smiling. The reason that Monty Python is so funny is that they mock, tons of meaningless words, and we laugh because it's sort of true. And by the way, both of those cultures, I would note, have over 1,000 years of unbroken political and cultural hegemony. Consistency, tradition really matters, and you don't mess with tradition. At the other extreme, I'd be interested to hear your take. I think not the Belgians, but the Dutch. The Dutch are about as blunt, in your face as I have experienced culturally. If they think you're stupid, they'll say you're stupid, and here's why. And no apologies for it. They consider it to be very efficient. And if you live in Holland for a while, you end up saying, well, it really is pretty efficient, actually. That's my take. How about you?
All right, I'll give you my take, and it'll be pretty direct, kind of, sort of like the Dutch, I suppose. I mean, I grew up 30 kilometers from the border, so I'm practically Dutch. I look Dutch, and I seem Dutch. And the reason I said you're not going to make fun of Belgians is, well, A, because I am one, but this famous concept of the Belgian dentist. I don't know if you heard of this. In investment circles, it's pretty common. So
Belgian dentist?
the Belgian dentist is someone who apparently only buys, the safest AAA rated bonds and investment
Oh,
products, and they're highly risk averse. And so they're extremely looking for stability and for
Ah,
sort of. So I thought you were going to go down that road, but you didn't. So kudos to you.
I see.
I did live in Holland for 18 months, and they are pretty direct. I'd say that trust is similar and different in a couple of ways. I think Asian cultures are more about communal trust rather than individual trust
Yes,
between people, between individuals. I
yes,
think in a business environment, and that's what we're talking about here,
yep,
there's generally, I think people are quick to trust, but they're not deep to trust. And what I mean by that is, I will meet someone at a
yes,
networking event, and on the face of it, I will assume that person is a capable professional with a good product and who's good at what they do and who will keep their promises. But I will test that a little bit. I will validate that a little bit along the way. And I'm assuming that most business professionals are the same. I don't know if here's the thing about the directness, and then we'll quickly go to a last question, which I can't believe. Stephanie, thank you for asking that question. It's related to culture, if you'd believe it, um, which is um, I think the Dutch and their directness in a lot of other sort of European countries is actually seen as a sign of trustworthiness. My own people,
oh, no question.
my own people, the Belgians have a reputation for sort of being a little bit circumventing, being very diplomatic, and some people find that difficult to deal with because they say it's always like that. Belgians will never speak their mind. You never really know what's going on. So it's
Right.
kind of
The great
those
virtue
sort.
of directness is you have very little doubt about what they're thinking. That goes to credibility. That's very important. Do we think that they are actually saying what they think? Do we think they're saying the truth, or do we think that for any one of 1,000 reasons they are holding back? So
Ab-
directness absolutely contributes to credibility. We may
abs-
feel it's rude, but it's true.
Absolutely. And part of being trustworthy is keeping to the timeline. We've got 2 minutes left. And believe it or not, when I asked a question about culture, and I promise I wasn't glancing at the screen, Stephanie asked a question, which is on the trustworthiness equation. So I'm going to let you take this one, Charlie. Do you think intimacy is the strongest trust driver across all cultures? Which countries did you do the research for the B2B businesses in?
Well, shoot, I'll have to be credible here. I was just this morning talking about we need to dig into our database and to be able to answer that question by cultural area. It's a little bit tricky. I don't have a clean answer, and the survey was not done in a broad, statistically valid way. It's made up of people who found their way to the website trustedadvisor.com and took our quiz. That means it's disproportionately Western, probably disproportionately U.S., although there's a good representation of European, Asian, and Australian, and so forth. It's disproportionately high in professionals, uh, and I think that well, I don't know. I'm not going to attempt to answer that. My gut tells me that intimacy probably ranks pretty high in all cultures, but I can't honestly tell you I can prove that with data, so I won't.
All right. To Stephanie, if you want, if there's a question behind a question or a particular purpose, don't hesitate to get in touch with Charlie. I think if you just Google Charles H. Green, then you'll
Yeah,
land on
or
it.
again, cgreen
Trust,
at trustedadvisor.com.
that's right. Or just Google Trusted Advisor. You'll land on Charlie's webpage. If you want more interviews, I've done interviews with Charlie and David. We've chatted before, a couple of joint blog posts. You can find all of that on ahoclutens.com. And with that, just a big thank you to everybody here. Things went a little bit differently, but from the participation rates and the number of people that stuck with us to the end, I think you got some good value from this. Go out, be trustworthy. I mean, what can I say?
May you
Trust,
trust and be trustworthy.
absolutely, yes. And I, maybe Charlie, to cap things off, one final comment, one final quote, or a tip, or an idea, one final thing.
Well, there's this paradoxical quality at the heart of trust. The less you worry about yourself and the more you worry about others, the more both of you will end up well. So a big trick in trust in sales and business is stop worrying about your bottom line. Stop worrying about what's in it for you. Worry about what's in it for them. And you know what? It may sound like a Beatles song or a Buddhist koan, but it's good hardcore bottom line capitalism too.
All right, love that. And here's mine. If you're out there selling anything, whether you're selling full time, you're selling part time, and when you're in front of a buyer, just being trustworthy, just following up on your commitments, being a little bit vulnerable, not being afraid of looking like a little bit foolish sometimes, and asking questions which you think you assume you know the answers to, will give your buyer the impression that you are trustworthy. Not only the impression, they will know that you're trustworthy, and that will be a huge influencer and will set you apart. And I'm speaking from personal experience here, will set you apart from everybody else who comes in, looks the same, dresses the same, talks the same, has the same deck, has the same presentation, has the, the big concepts and the models. And it is a huge, huge competitive advantage that you as an individual seller have to go out there and to generate more business. So with that, thank you to all. And thank you, Charlie, especially to you. Thank you,
Thanks, everybody.
David. I know you were here for the start, and we'll find a way of getting your stuff out to the people on the webinar. And thank you.